I've been looking forward to this discussion, and you and I were playing tag for a long, long time about how we should be able to shape it. Number one, Don and I had a memo that we'd both wear a purple tie on the last day of the Future Minerals Forum. All jokes aside, I'd love to have you, if you can, because of your expertise and you're an inventor. We know the demand that's out there for certain metals. Does that create a sense of complacency when it comes to innovation or not, John? Don, what are you looking for now that could change quite radically over the next decade?
Well, I think that the urgency with trying to keep the supply chain stocked and secure, there are two approaches to that. One is to take the steps that keep the inventory high and so on. But my approach is always to invent, and to invent more secure inputs that will give us a reliable supply of the minerals that we want to convert to metals.
Yeah, so I was watching Bloomberg this morning. I was saying in my opening comments, and we had Jeff Curry, the commodities analyst and strategist for Goldman, who's pretty good at his game, said that copper is the new oil. But you talk about this unfounded complacency. Do you think this industry needs to innovate to take a look at what's going to be needed in the future? So you can cover whether it's copper, do you want to take a look at lithium, what's been used with nickel, what are the primary demand drivers do you see in the future, and where does innovation need to come from?
Well, in the case of copper, we heard yesterday that on the horizon we foresee major shortfall in supply. The demand for copper is going to rise as we try to intensify the electrification. And so in this audience, of course, the first response is mining. And mining is important, of course, to get the ore out of the ground. But that doesn't give you something that you can draw wire with. You have to convert the ore into metal. And that requires smelting. And the smelting technology that we have today is very old. It's inefficient. It's very polluting in terms of emissions to air, to water, to soil. And so there's room for innovation there to make something that is far superior, that will give us better metal at a lower price point with zero emissions. So let's get innovating. That's where we need it. And we can go across the various other metals that people need. I mean, if I want to talk about future-proof metals, copper is one of them. We're going to need copper. I cannot imagine copper falling out of favor. We're going to need iron because we're going to build things out of steel, and we want to make steel green, and aluminum. Those are the three. And those are three that they're ripe for innovation. I've already worked on innovation in the steel sector. Aluminum is out there, and copper is ready.
Good. Where's the innovation in aluminum? I know there's been projects here too on the smeltering side to try to feed here in Saudi Arabia. I know the same thing in the UAE, using green energy to try to power the plants. But where do you see the innovation that you're talking about?
Well, in the smelting of copper, it is, of aluminum, it's with electrolysis. And in the electrolysis, they use a carbon anode. And so that carbon anode is consumed during the electrolytic process, and it emits carbon dioxide. And so the big innovation is to replace the consumable carbon anode with an inert anode. So now you feed in aluminum oxide, you make aluminum at one electrode and you make oxygen at the other electrode. So that's the big innovation. So now with green electrons, zero emissions from the entire value chain of copper mining and smelting.
Give me your thoughts on what you see in Saudi Arabia here, going into hydrogen, for example, or the stock of renewable energy to work into manufacturing, and where are the innovative challenges and opportunities, would you say? We talked about the legacy of the other mining countries in our previous discussion. Can we apply it here in terms of innovation?
Yeah, well, what we're seeing here in Saudi Arabia is a great push for renewable energy, wind and solar. And so with green electricity, then that opens up the possibility for carbon-free electrolytic conversion of ore to metal. So I use that as my template. That is my point of departure. If somebody says to me, Sadaway, how are you going to convert copper ore into copper metal? without emissions? First answer, electrons. If you give me green electrons, I'll turn dirt into metal. And so that's the point of departure.
Good. I know you don't want to talk your own book, but you're an inventor and you go through different phases. You're constantly inventing and reinventing, and some of those come to fruition as startups and investors come into the game. But what are you working on now? I met one of your colleagues on the flight over from the UK. What gets you out of bed as an inventor today?
Well, there are a number of technologies. There's a new one in batteries that you met, Emily. This is pure lithium to make a lithium metal battery. And the invention there is to address your first question, which is supply chain. How do we secure cobalt, nickel, manganese, graphite? What do? Invent them out. Our battery has no cobalt, no nickel. So what do we do instead? Well, it turns out it dovetails with what's going on here in the kingdom. With oil brines, we can extract lithium from the oil brines, and also there's a vanadium in the combustion residue, ash, and so we can use vanadium oxide in the electrode, and we have a lithium metal battery that doesn't have a volatile flammable electrolyte and doesn't use any of these tight supply metals. So that's invention. That's just one, and I could go on, but in the interest of time, we can park it.
Yeah, we have about 7 minutes, but
So
what worries you in terms of the demand that we see today and the shortages that Jeremy Weir, for example, talked about, and Dominic Barton yesterday in our opening panel, like acute shortages? We've never seen the gap between what's available and the demand that's coming. So take it from your vantage point as an inventor. What needs to be done to shrink that gap, as opposed to just trying to get as much product onto the market?
I think it goes back to invention. I mean, there's two parts to all of these things. I mean, Robert Friedland has said over and over that anything that we have in front of us, we either grew it agriculturally or we dug it out of the ground and converted it into a useful product, whether it's a polymer or a metal. So with that as a backdrop, so we've got the front end, and everybody here at this meeting understands how to mine and so on. But then there's the conversion step. And if we get smarter about the conversion, then that can ease the tension in the supply chain.
Well, speaking of the supply chain, you would be remiss in not mentioning and us discussing the processing power and market share of China today. I kind of have a premise, which I brought up yesterday, is like we don't do a great job of mapping internationally, whether it's grain from Russia and Ukraine, then you have disruption, overdependence on Russian gas going into the European Union, forestalling investment into the Eastern Med, for example, or greater discoveries in Algeria and in Egypt. How about when it comes to the mining industry itself? How are we doing on global mapping, the downstream areas of processing that China has 85% of the market share? Does it worry you? Can it be solved? What's the role of Saudi Arabia in that process, do you think?
Well, the dominant role of China in, for example, things that go into electric vehicles, both the battery components. For lithium ion, there's very little battery metal. It's compounds, the oxides that go into the cathode, and then you have the lithium and the graphite and so on. And all of that ends up going through a pinch point in China. So the answer to that, it's not about mapping, it's about inventing. Invent what I told you about pure lithium, invent our way out of it. And then the other piece, of course, is the electric car axiomatically has magnets in the motors. And those magnets are dependent on rare earths. And China has a disproportionate fraction of rare earth resources. And as we know, they don't freely export rare earth oxides so that we can convert them into rare earth metals and make the magnets. So what's my response? You can talk all you want over trade negotiations. My response is invent them out of it. We don't need that stuff anymore.
Are we there already or not?
If we were, I wouldn't be sitting here right now. I'd be sipping cocktails on my back in a swimming pool. No, there's still room. There's still room for innovation.
Right. But it's interesting you have state planning of that nature, not to that extent in the kingdom, but you can see the mapping that they're doing from the upstream to the downstream processing and value added into the mining sector as it goes into this journey. But you have to give some credit to the Chinese. I mean, they need all of everything with 1.4 billion people, right? So they've needed oil, they've needed gas, they're using coal, they're major producers in solar PVs, of course. But electric vehicles they've thought about battery creation. They're challenging the rest of the world, right? It's got like a 20-year head start on this process.
That's correct.
Okay, and what can be done?
Invent.
No, but you say that, but is it literally a lead time that can be caught up to, do you think?
Well, there's a timeline on all the new inventions, because first you have to demonstrate, reduce to practice at the lab bench, and then, of course, upscale, demonstrate that it works at industrial scale, and that takes time. But you can shorten that timeline with resources. And what I learned yesterday here at this meeting was that the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is making huge commitments to shorten those timelines, to make the investment, and in parallel to make the funding available with these loans and so on and so forth to attract investment and thereby accelerate those timelines.
Okay. You've had some meetings on the sidelines here at a very senior level, because I tried to get a meeting for a coffee to talk about this panel, and we did it this morning. So you're a busy man. Give us your inkling, because you are an inventor and a big thinker. When you sit in the meetings and you look at the global mapping of Saudi Arabia, we had that last panel that finished on Vision 2030, and then the KPIs that need to be measured along the way. What are your thoughts? I have a lot of skeptics in Europe, where I'm living, and in the UK. I hear it from America all the time. They don't believe in the Vision 2030. They don't think it's the real deal. You can give an unvarnished look at what you're hearing and the planning and the connectivity between the cabinet ministers that we've even seen in the last 24 hours. Share your thoughts on how these pieces of the puzzle come together in the kingdom.
My unvarnished opinion is that those stereotypes need to be blown up. I was thoroughly impressed with all of the people that I met, the senior people and the young people. I met nobody that I thought was just an empty box that was there because of some family connections. Everybody I met was literate, technically literate, very up to date, and with the resources behind them. I think people need to revise their opinions.
So it's a dated view, I think, particularly in the United States, wouldn't you?
I would say so, yes.
Okay, very, very good. The last thing I wanted to talk to you about is to get I had this vision of the New Silk Road, and have followed it for the last 15 years, but in the mining sector, it looks like the kingdom wants to put that into practice. So actually investing in Africa and Asia and taking that to Central Asia. This could be a very prosperous belt. I know there's a Belt and Road Initiative in China, which has stuttered or sputtered because of the lending and the debt in some of the countries. But when it comes to mining, it could come to life. Could it not?
It could. It could. I mean, when I look at something like what I did with the liquid metal battery, the plan with that is to make it go global by manufacturing it locally. So very much that batteries in Africa should be built in Africa by Africans using African resources. That way they become authors of their own futures. And so I applaud Saudi Arabia for looking at those kinds of investments to make this technology go locally throughout the world, so that these people can all be participants, not just receivers, purchasers of this technology that comes from one plant in China. So I think this is a very wise approach.
Good. This is not your first visit to Saudi Arabia, is it?
It is.
Oh, it is? Oh, I didn't realize that. Oh, well, welcome to the
I've been
kingdom.
here less than 72 hours.
Okay.
These are very fresh opinions.
Oh, very good. Can we give him a nice round of applause? Don Sadoway of MIT. Thanks very much, Don. It's great to see you.